everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without a Plot. It's coming to you from the Wood of the Holly, right here under the sign. It's appropriate that I'm coming to you from the Wood of the Holly, otherwise known as Hollywood, because we're here to talk about Hollywood, and specifically the great genre that has animated Hollywood since its earliest days. With me today on the other side of this incredible digital divide is a good friend. We did a podcast almost 2 years ago, I think now, about his earlier book called The Warner Brothers, about a dysfunctional, wealthy Jewish family and how they shaped popular culture in America in the 20th century. But he's out with another book that is equally compelling, and I just had the privilege of reading. It's called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And for those of you that don't know, get out of the show or hang around and realize that The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is also, not coincidentally, the title of a great John Ford movie starring John Wayne, James Stewart, and Lee Marvin, with some other great additions. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause. Chris Yogerst, how are you?
Thank you for having me again. It's always a blast to talk to you.
Okay, cool. Well, you wrote this book about a movie that is in, I guess, the pantheon of American Westerns, and people have various feelings about it, as I do, and I'll share them with you. But let's just start off with a two-word sentence. Why Liberty Valance?
Is a couple reasons. I mean, it's the one thing we'll definitely circle back to, which is this idea of printing the legend, right? Like when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. I mean, there's this line in the movie that, as when I first saw it, I knew it was profound, but didn't fully understand it. But as I aged, it meant more to me, and it kept nagging at me. And I always, I didn't find myself like rewatching this film all the time, but I felt myself thinking about it a lot. Mm-hmm. And over the years, I had mentioned it to people that really liked Westerns, and I'd always, to my surprise, get like pushback where it was like, I didn't really like that one a lot. And it was there were two people. One of them was Andrew Patrick Nelson, who edits the series for this. Old friend of mine. We met at an academic conference where we were both presenting on Westerns. Mm-hmm. And so we'd always kind of had this back and forth about Liberty Valance. And then when I was writing the Warner Brothers book, I was emailing back and forth with the great Kevin Brownlow. And I had mentioned this, and he gave me the same response where he's like, I never really fully jumped on board with that one. But they both said, you should, this is why you should write the book, because we don't hate the film. We just don't, maybe what are we missing? And then when the series came out, my buddy's like, all right, now you have to do this. I have a series for you. Now you have to write this book. So I did.
Well, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, firstly, was not a Warner Brothers movie. I believe it was a Paramount movie. Yeah. It was released in 1962. It was directed by John Ford, who people had various expectations about when a John Ford Western came about, first of which was Monument Valley and the great expanse that the Western provided, the big vistas, and really the freedom that was promised in the West was largely due to space.
Right.
Vast expanses of truly uninhabitable land. One of the mythologies of the West versus the truth is that the West, from the Rocky Mountains to this Pacific Rim where I'm sitting, was uninhabitable frigging desert. And basically could not support the life that these people were contesting for, because until John Wesley Powell and Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam, this space is kind of uninhabited. But by the way, it's sort of intimated too in the movie, because she talks on the train returning, I think, or at the very end of the movie, about irrigation and when the dams come, which is another overlay to me. We didn't really talk about it, but water and the absence of it in the West.
Well, yeah, you'd have no Los Angeles without water, right? I mean, this is everything that made Chinatown, right? Like there's, there's something fascinating about the West and the frontier, and the difficulties that even getting to it, were made of. And then once you got there, now you have a whole other set of difficulties.
Right. And what was the West geographically changes over history. So, the dawn of the nation, the West is Ohio.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. The frontier. When you got just the colonies, the frontier is still way out east.
Yeah, Daniel Boone,
Yeah.
goes across the Cumberland Gap to the West, the uninhabited West. And then it, traverses the Rocky Mountains. And even before you get to the Rocky Mountains, the West is really um, not so much the Great Plains, but where the Plains Indians are, the Sioux, the Oglala Sioux. One point I wanted to make about the man who shot Liberty Valance, I really want to deep dive into it for a whole slew of reasons, is one of the elements that's conspicuously absent in the movie are native people, Indians.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even exist. It's as if the people occupied Shinbone without any Aboriginal
Right.
resistance.
It is strange, isn't it? And of course, not long. And of course, Ford had included natives in previous movies, and then after this, he goes and he makes Cheyenne Autumn, right? But that's one of the biggest criticisms, I think, of Ford, who through most of his career could be defined as like this progressive of his time progressive guy. But then there's like this big glaring omission, whether it's either how he depicts natives or the fact that they're not there, right? And then tries to make up for that in Cheyenne Autumn. And it's strange in this movie, but I feel like that's maybe why this movie is maybe more personal to him, because I see it as him confronting his own past, his own, he is an old man. This is one of his last movies. And, he's, that when he was a kid, the people he was growing, the elderly he was around would have been of this era that he's depicting. Right. So this is like, he's watched that era erode, from the perspective of like, at least like the settled white man, these kinds of communities. And I guess, I don't know, I'm forgetting a lot about like where he, I mean, he grew up out east,
He was
right?
born in Maine,
In
and
Maine.
he died. I'm 69, and when I look at the pictures of John Ford of 69, he looks like he's 99.
Right. Or 199. Yeah.
Exactly. So he's born in the last decade of the 19th century, which it's important to remember that if you were born anywhere up till the 20s and the 30s, even the 40s, you could have very well have spoken to Civil War veterans. They were still alive.
Right.
It's like World War II veterans. There's a remnant, a shrinking remnant population of them as well. Yeah. So he's from the East. He's Irish. And his brother, I think, preceded him into the movie business in the silent era. The thing about Liberty Valance for me is that it's, like you say, it was filmed on the lot at Paramount, which is
No Monument Valley here.
Yeah, it's literally less than a mile down Gower Gulch from where I'm sitting at this moment. And so the movie feels, for a Western, very much cloistered, and, captive to the sound stages. Even, like I said, the first scene where Lee Marvin, Liberty Valance, overtakes the stagecoach and brutalizes Jimmy Stewart. That was filmed on a stage too, so it lacks the expansiveness of the other Ford movies, or
Right. And I think, and maybe for me, maybe one of the reasons why I took to this movie a little faster than some others, I feel like this was a movie I saw early on in my first exploration of John Ford. So like I'm sure I had seen The Searchers, a couple other movies, and then this one, so I hadn't seen like 40 movies with Monument Valley, and then this, and then I feel like I got screwed out of a Monument Valley movie, right? So it wasn't as big of a issue that first viewing, and I feel like having seen a bunch of other John Ford movies and now understanding that this would be great with Monument Valley. For me, I feel like it makes us focus more on the story because there's not much to look at, right? Like the setting is not like we were talking about before. Like it looks like a TV Western.
Yes,
Right?
it does. Yeah.
This is an A-list movie with John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart.
Right. And it looks like it could be, the pilot to Rawhide or something.
Right, exactly. Exactly. It
Yeah.
does.
Well, the movie, and I just have my own thesis about Westerns, but the movie lives or the bulk of the story lives in a period that we call the Wild West, where things are wild, where law has not been really taken root, where statehood has yet to arrive. And a lot of that, and when you're talking about history, it's really about the period of time that from like 1865 to 1875, maybe peeling into the 1880s, which is really about Reconstruction. And what was wild about the West, which is rarely talked about in movies, sometimes so, is that my view, and I would like someday maybe to write a script that embraces this idea, is that the West that was wild was really a dystopian universe where hundreds of thousands of surviving men from the Civil War are wandering around with very severe forms of PTSD. After all, they had seen battles where 20,000 people were just extinguished in a day, whether it was Gettysburg or, Antietam. The list is long. And so, we saw that after Vietnam. There were a number of movies and there was all kinds of reports of Vietnam veterans who whacked out. I mean, famously, Taxi Driver is that. And somehow I think the legend has prevailed at the expense of the historical truth. The truth is this kind of post-war apocalyptic period of Reconstruction and failed Reconstruction.
Right. And that's one of the things I think Ford was getting at with this idea of printing the legend, because that line wasn't in Dorothy Johnson's. I mean, that's from the script. And then, he was able to center that in the movie. And it's even maybe he's looking back at his career of Westerns, and he did a lot of printing the legend, right? I mean, you look at, historians will watch, historians of the West will watch like My Darling Clementine, and while it's a great movie, they'll be like, a lot of liberties here. But it makes a great movie, right? So there's a difference between the movie and the reality. And I think this is also where, with the guy being born in the late 1800s, for him, the Wild West was not ancient past like it is for us, right? And it's like I feel this now, like with my students that were born in the late 2000s. It's like I feel I start to define myself as like a 20th century person. I mean, I was born in the 1980s, so it's like that era is such a that so much of that century still is a part of me, right? Where like it's when I talk about the ancient, I do media history and I have to explain to my students like what a video store was. Every now and then, one of them lived in a community where there was still a family video around or something, but it's like it's old to them,
Right.
and so for John Ford,
By the way, just I don't want to interrupt. Here's a video, and it's the movie I wrote and directed called The Solar Opposite. I feel that maybe there's a nuclear holocaust and everything's destroyed, and somehow in the detritus and burial, this survives. My movie might be the only evidence of the great cinema flowering of the 20th century, but that's another story. Yeah.
There you go. and yeah, I mean, so you it's like and that's why I feel like this movie kept nagging at me, because it's like, as I saw the passage of time, I saw that passage weigh on me in different ways. And it made me relate to the movie and try to understand like what was weighing on the writers and the director and what would have been weighing on the stars. And there's like a thesis of this movie that is like bigger than the West or the Western or of Hollywood, right? It's something that I feel like we can all look at in our own lives in interesting ways. So I guess that was why I continued thinking about it, even though it is a visually lackluster Western.
Yeah. Well, the movie at the end is suffused with a kind of melancholy of loss. Vera Miles, who plays the love interest, still carries a cactus rose in her heart for John Wayne, Tom Donovan. And so, yes, I think as we age, there are some other the movie feels that. I mean, you have an aging crew there too. You have two main stars who are too old for their parts by about a long shot. And, it's a little painful sometimes to watch. Not that they're bad. They're not. I think that Jimmy Stewart's Mr. Smith, who goes to Washington, was the right kind of age for the young Rance Stoddard. And maybe the Ringo Kid who's wild and has got this energy.
Right.
You
Well,
know,
and on the other end, like with John Wayne, like his last movie, The Shootist, it's like you couldn't have had. I mean, he was the right age, the right. I mean, here's something. He was dying of cancer while filming it, right? Like this.
right,
There's so much of this movie is real.
right, right. He's in sync with his own life. This movie's a little out of sync, but I mentioned this to you before, but to me, when I look at the movie and I know some of the history, it's in 1962, and John Ford is he is a World War II veteran. I mean, he was an officer and filmed and chronicled the war. Made a really great war movie that is underrated, and that's called "They Were Expendable," about the PP
Absolutely.
folks with John Wayne, who's
Yep.
great in that. At the dawn of the war in the Philippines. What's essential to all these movies is where does violence fit in? Is there use for it? And I think the takeaway for people like Jimmy Stewart, who flew him God knows how many missions over Germany as a pilot, and John Ford, who was, I believe, at the liberation of concentration camp,
Mm-hmm.
filmed this with George Stevens and Frank Capra. I think they had some clear ideas about what it takes to preserve freedom in the face of tyranny, and that under certain circumstances, there was no other alternative to the gun.
For sure. And that's clear in this movie too, because you have, I mean, Rance makes a really good case for progress, right? He wins people over with his, willingness to, he's not early on, right? He's not dedicated to like this hyper masculine role. Like he's helping out in the kitchen, he's wearing an apron, and John Wayne is laughing at him.
Right.
But also they see it's like, oh wow, he's really, this is a new thing, right? And as soon as he starts, he's back on his feet and he's opens the school and people are learning. You can see the joy that brings and the ownership that brings to the lives of all these people in the classroom. But that only goes so far, right? Like that's the real difficult piece of this, and that's kind of what you're getting at, like what we learned in World War II, right? We were going to talk Hitler out of this, so we needed to bring tanks and planes and bombs and guns and all this kind of stuff. So, and that's why even Rance realized this in this movie. He's like, we people need to respect the law and all this kind of stuff, and eventually he hits a wall and he picks up a gun himself, right?
Right. That's where the movie, for me, resonated most powerfully. After all, even Gandhi struggled with those answers when he was asked about Hitler and how to deal with it nonviolently. Also, you mentioned those classroom scenes. And, what's really fundamental at that moment in the big revolution, not just the Civil War, but the Reconstruction Amendments. I've talked about this at length in various other contexts. 13, 14, and 15. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship, says if you use a gun in the act of insurrection, guess what? You can't hold office. Well, that was run over like a fucking speed bump.
Right.
Um,
How about that?
Yeah. Birthright citizenship, all the things that are embraced in this huge gift from the Civil War, the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment, which is universal suffrage, um, voting right, that which all the voting rights legislation flows out of 15. And so he's having these lessons, and it's a little bit the kind of unspoken promise of this new America that the Civil War bequeathed, that Lincoln bequeathed to the nation. His picture's conspicuous.
Yeah, Woody Strode is standing there with Lincoln, right? I mean, perfect.
And Woody Strode, we mentioned this earlier, but I have always been a fan of Woody. Most fans probably saw him in Spartacus, which was he was beautiful and extremely athletic. And what a lot of people don't know is that what Jackie Robinson did for baseball, he did for the NFL. Woody Strode, Kenny Washington integrated the NFL.
Yeah.
And also, they were teammates with Jackie Robinson at UCLA down the road here as a great football player. And I read this too. When John Ford was near his end and was infirm, Woody Strode was his caretaker, his caregiver.
Yeah, that says a lot.
Yeah. And he starred in another movie for Ford, Sergeant Rutledge.
Sergeant Rutledge, yeah.
Right.
That's another one that kind of flies under the radar
Mhm.
because there's so many great movies, but that's another one that's really powerful. And I think you could look at that one and Liberty Valance also in the context of their era, in that these are, in the early 60s, right? The civil rights discussion is really, really moving.
Oh yeah.
And so that those movies, even though they take place in the Old West, are very much about that. They definitely nod to that contemporary struggle that people in the theater would have been, automatically connected.
Right. And also McCarthyism is there right in the wake of McCarthyism. I'm not sure how that manifests in Liberty Valance, but
But definitely in Rutledge,
yeah, it's all there brewing in the soup.
or
And
if anything, in Liberty Valance, I mean, in the character Liberty Valance, I mean, just the bully mentality, right? And that was, that McCarthy was all over that, of course. And it's like, how do you deal with some of these? And in a lot of times, it's with force.
right, and courage,
Hmm.
because you know, by all accounts, I had a dream the other night because I do boxing training that I was scheduled for a professional fight with like Sonny Liston. It was like a dream. Okay. And I knew I was going to get my ass kicked. Like, and I had all the skill I had just to not be killed. And I remember, like, I fortunately woke up before the opening bell. But,
That's
but
good.
what I felt was like, I just have to be brave here, and courage when you're really facing certain defeat. But for the fact that he's saved by John Wayne, he could very easily have been killed right there on the street.
Right. And what's interesting about that too is that Rance's character, I mean, he knows the truth. Um, but he still lets the legend go, right? Like, and that's another interesting part of this, where it's like he knows that for people to, for everybody to get behind him, he already got some people behind him without violence, but then he can get the rest of these, the rest of these, Western caricatures, these tough guy caricatures behind him, if they think he is the guy who stood up and killed Liberty Valance, right? So he lets that go, and that's of course why he tells this legend. Corks this whole thing to the journalist, because there's the weight of that. But there's an interesting piece of that too, where it's like, and we've talked about this in lots of other occasions too, just in our conversations about history, where it's like there's this, what makes the great story, what actually happened, and sometimes it takes a while before we get, the real story,
Right.
because the legend is convenient for a while, and that's what happens in this movie.
Right. And also, being a capable warrior has tremendous currency at the ballot box. It's not an accident that our own PVP, Putin's vice president, posed as the man who got shot, and his currency as a strong man, as a warrior king, it works. It has
Right.
works. I don't know to what extent Jimmy Stewart traded on that to become a senator, but it still lives in the minds of the voters.
Right. Well, and that's what's so fascinating about the end of this movie too. I mean, he just tells this whole story, and they're on the train, and then like, oh, nothing's too good for the man who shot Liberty Valance. Like, it's still like he just sees like that's still gonna just continue, right? Like,
I'm
you're never gonna get everybody. You put the truth out there, and it's just never gonna catch up to the legend.
going to talk about some of the actors in the movie because
Yeah.
some of them are longtime John Ford people. Of course, John Wayne, he goes back from Stagecoach. Lee Marvin, who goes on to do Donovan's Reef with John Ford.
Ford, yeah.
Woody Strode, we mentioned. John Carradine, who shows up in one of the greatest American movies of all time, and that is The Grapes of Wrath. Andy Devine is, I guess, from Kingman, Arizona, and he is the Stagecoach driver.
Yep.
Appears also in How the West Was Won. And John Quaylen, who was, I think, even in The Searchers. Of course, The Searchers with John Wayne as well. So the cast, is part of his repertory company as well. I'm going to name some movies these are my favorite movies, and we can just go into them, that are within this genre. And I'm going to just spill them out and you can react. Red River, My Darling Clementine, Butch Cassidy, God bless you, John, Robert Redford and the Sundance Kid. She wore a yellow ribbon. Fort Apache, sort of a movie that lives on the other side of kind of the ideological divide. Little Big Man, Outlaw Josie Wales, Going Back in Time, Stagecoach, Shane, which echoes some of the themes also in Liberty Valance, because you also have the cattle interests versus the more popular agricultural interests, the small farmers. After all, Liberty Valance himself is like a violent agent of the cattle interests. And you also have the echoes of the Civil War in Shane with Jack Palance.
Mm-hmm.
How the West Was Won, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Jeremiah Johnson, Cat Ballou, Giant, and The Last Picture Show.
Yeah, I know we talked about some of these before. I mean, I think it needs something like, well, there's kind of two ways, like something like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, you have this unexpected setting, right? You have a Western that takes place in like the snowy mountains, right? Like it's almost like an extension of Anthony Mann Westerns, right? That were up in like the tighter quarters up in the mountains, right? Like, so it kind of gives us a different view. But then something like Little Big Man, I think, is closer to Valance in the sense that it completely pulls the rug out of the legend. That whole movie just gives us a completely different view of what was like the popular Wild West hero story. Communities were just raided and whatever the next thing, but here it sits us in the middle of that. And now we watch it from a different perspective. Cowboys and Indians, where the Indians are kind of these faceless, replaceable, characters. Now they are the main characters, and that gives us the kind of printing the legend moment where we realize it's like, oh, there's a whole nother perspective to this.
Right. And when you talk about Little Big Man, it's really made during Vietnam. So when you see these slaughters, what you're really seeing is the My Lai massacre.
Yep.
And even when you talk about Vietnam, the nomenclature of the military was air cavalry. The strategies were strategic hamlets, which were a nice standard for reservations. And so, that's a movie of its moment as well. Like, I kind of believe that Liberty Valance is about the World War II generation, really, in some ways. That's the big event in all these people's lives. And, similarly, Little Big Man lives in Vietnam. And even the military was, search and destroy, all this stuff, the eradication of villages. That's the same strategy that the U.S. Army used against the Plains Indians in the 1870s.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, there was the whole Vietnam era. Like, they didn't make war movies like they did during World War II, right? Like, you had, there's a couple of exceptions, but it was like there's, you got the Wild Bunch and Ilzana's Raid and like all these movies that seem like they have their place in the Western canon and it comments on the West, but also because of when they're made, they also work as like metaphors for Vietnam.
The movie The Green Berets stars John Wayne. I think Ford directed that.
I think John Wayne directed that, and John Ford gave him advice on it, if I remember.
Okay, that may be, but he's kind of applying some of those same legends to a new conflict, and of course, that movie feels out of sync with its times, and John Wayne is drifting into social irrelevancy at that moment, and that movie is a conspicuous example.
And that's another interesting thing about Wayne. That's one thing I was surprised with writing this book when I was talking about the reactions to the movie, where you had, there's always this, and it's not an unjustified view, but it's like there is this understanding, and usually it's among people that haven't seen a ton of Westerns, that the Western genre is just a boys' club, and it's like there are so many Westerns that prove that wrong. But when I was looking at the reactions to Wayne in this movie, when I found Molly Haskell and Joan Didion being among some of like the biggest John Wayne fans, as well as fans of this movie, I thought that was really interesting, because it's like they could see something in Wayne. Because I've run into people, you probably today too, where they're like, well, I don't watch John Wayne movies because I don't like his politics, right? Like, they've heard like the Playboy interview he gave, which is really kind of inexcusable, right? And but then you the more you learn about John Wayne, like if you read Scott Iman's book, it's like the way he treated people like Woody Strode, right? People that were not treated very well by our culture were treated very well by John Wayne, even though he would go out in the press and say stupid shit, right? Like there was all of these things moving at once, and it's like when you have people like Molly Haskell and Joan Didion visiting sets of John Wayne, they're like, you can't help but not like this guy, or you can't help but like this guy, and I found that really fascinating. That gives us a little bit of perspective of how the genre has an allure, and right now we're seeing a big resurgence of it on TV, right? The whole Taylor Sheridan verse, and you're seeing, all these spin-offs and, different versions of the West. You've got Yellowstone that, feels like it, but you have the 1888, which is about like the actual Old West, but then even something like Landman, which is coming back. It's another kind of interesting frontier there, right? I don't know if you're watching that one at all, but being a Texas, I know you love the Texas history. I mean, where you've got, the frontier in the sense of you're dealing with, your billionaire CEO and all of his politics, and then you're dealing with the cartel coming over the border, messing with your crews. There's definitely a lawlessness aspect to that show, even though it takes place in modern times.
Well, my favorite Western is Red River. And
it's great.
It's actually like a dime store novel, Red River, that I read, and it's actually really good. And one of the things that's in the novel,
I need to read it. I think the Criterion Collection Blu-ray came with the book.
I know, and I lent it to my dad, and I've never gotten it back. And but he loved reading it. But one of the things is the folks that lead that cattle drive, Montgomery Clift and those ranchers, they're all defeated Confederates returning to Texas after the war. And the South is destroyed. And this opportunity of this cattle drive is a chance economically to kind of reconnect with the Union, because after all, they're going to provide beef at the railhead in Kansas. But the problem is, how do you get there? It's going through Indian territory, and we're not sure, and it's very mysterious. It's a reconstruction story, in my view. Similarly, The Searchers, this guy, Civil War vet, unreconstructed Confederate, completely obsessed with race hatred now against the Indians, goes on a search, and his hatred is so overwhelming that it's unclear what he's going to do with his niece who's been kidnapped and despoiled. Is he going to kill her out of this sort of racial hatred or embrace her? Well, we know what happens, but all those stories live in the aftermath of this huge conflagration, which is the American Civil War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a country as well as the individuals within it searching for their identity, right? And that's one of the things. I mean, circling back to Liberty Valance, right? That's why Tom Donovan has such a meltdown, because it's not only he loses the girl at the end, but it's also the movie is kind of a signpost of the end of the Westerner. Like that guy was needed this time, but he may not be needed in the same capacity ever again, right? And like that, so that's like a huge identity blow to someone who was like the town's strongman that held it all together. He's no longer that hero. He was needed to help create the next hero.
Right. His relevancy within society is nullified. I can identify with that. That's why I'm surrounded by a lot of my extinct friends. Because I feel a connectivity to my dinosaur friends who left the Earth 67 million years ago with the catastrophe called an asteroid. So yeah, I relate to that as well. And the book it's a fun read, but you got to see the movie again to really fully feel the value of the book. And not only do you offer your own analysis, but there's a pretty clear summation of some of the critical response to the movie.
And I also try to analyze how, because this comes at the end of like the golden age of Westerns too. So I try to put it among, within this, situate it within like, we at the end of this massive era of Westerns, and what does it mean for the genre? How is it aged? That kind of stuff. And then I do, I do kind of a unique last chapter. I used to teach a pop culture and philosophy class with a philosopher, and we would use Joseph Campbell and we'd talk about the hero's journey. And that's why I had that last one of the last chapters on how this movie and a character and the characters fit within that hero's journey that we see in every big, we see Star Wars and Indiana Jones and all these, more contemporary, popular, iconic movies, that this trajectory that draws us to certain kinds of stories is so prevalent also in the Western.
Well, it's kind of an extinction event story in a way of a certain kind of a man. And at the core of it, how does it resonate to this moment? For me, I'm not, the be all and the end all, but for me, it's like violence, the gun. Those Confederates got to keep their guns after the Civil War at Appomattox. And really, in many ways, nobody's let go of those guns since. Somehow the gun has become a symbol of freedom and individuality, and the tool that we can shape our own destinies with, and without which we are impotent. And that's also a legend that might need to be disposed of.
Absolutely. There are nuances within this, right? Where these pieces of history have ripple effects that can take on directions we don't necessarily love, even if we can understand why we've needed and maybe even currently still need these things. We still need force, right? And we still need, there's a lot of reasons, and this has come up, and I know like Bill Maher has talked about this on his show and stuff too, where it's like, this idea of like that a few years ago that was real big was like defund the police, and it's like, you can be really critical of the police, but it's like we also still need them, right? Like if we just get rid of all of that, we don't want what that's going to be either.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that's why I like this movie, because it's like you could the ideas that it brings up, you could draw through lines to almost any period of history, even to our current moment, and it can help us make sense. It just gives us a sense. That's one thing I love about history, and this is kind of a connection to almost every conversation we've had, where it's like we can use the past to help make sense of the present. Right? There's usually something that has set a precedent, or it offers an example, or gives us a way to think about something that helps us. It gives us tools to navigate right now.
Right. Well, with respect to guns, you got two things. When you add guns and goofballs,
okay, the two big G's.
Yes, you have mayhem. Okay. Now, with all the science, in the Jewish tribe, it's called schmuckiness, but it's even worse. We have yet to evolve the science to remove the goofball gene from people, but we can reduce the guns. And so that's sort of, my theory. And in many ways, these legends that we've inherited have obscured the deeper truths that we need to kind of come to grips with. I kind of think that Liberty Valance is sort of angling in that direction.
I agree.
I mean, the surface legend is that Ransom was the one that dispatched Liberty Valance, and that's okay. It's whatever. But the deeper truth is the emergence of a more of a civil society, not based on violence, but based on law, based on a vision of equality that Lincoln pointed the country in a direction to. I think that's really the truth that the legends have sometimes obscured.
Right. And we see that. And I think it's important that when we see the older Rants, he's not there, brandishing a firearm at every turn, right? Like he seems to have embraced this peaceful future that violence was necessary to create, but he didn't want to perpetuate the violence.
Right. So, and that to me just comports well with this World War II kind of experience that they all had.
For sure.
Yeah. Chris Yogerst, you're genius. Folks, you got to read the book, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It is conveniently the same title as the movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and offers a very compelling window, not only into movie times and those times, but also our times, and legends and truth, and not so sure that Valance has so much liberty. I'm going to quickly get into Lee Marvin, who reprises the role in Cat Ballou for the benefit of an Oscar. He also was a World War II veteran,
right,
and had a vision of what that kind of violence and hatred meant. And I thought he embodied it really well.
Yeah, he plays a great villain for sure, and he had been on his way to that. I mean, before this movie, right? In some great noir films.
Dirty Dozen, he does in the 60s, which is really one of the great kind of war movies of its decade.
And then, is The Killers? Is that what they?
Yeah, The Killers.
Yeah,
and Point Blank. I think he kind of
yes.
involved.
Point Blank is fantastic.
A great movie presence. A great presence in the cinema. And for someone who's an actor myself, scuffling for my little, pieces of just little parts that come down to the bottom of the sea, little bits and pieces. Those Sterling Hayden, Lee Marvin, Gene Hackman, those guys are my lodestars, So that's that. Folks, read the book. Check it out, and if you get a chance, check out his book about Warner Brothers. Look out for, you got a Substack page too, and your articles. You're a consistent mirror on our times with specifically movies and popular culture and the Warner Brothers and the whole thing. And you're sitting there in, where is it, Milwaukee.
Milwaukee, yeah.
Milwaukee, one of those places. Is that the West? I don't know. That's the Midwest, It's out there in the WPL, otherwise known as White People Land. I'm here underneath the Hollywood sign in Beechwood Canyon. Folks, thanks for hanging. Check out the book and all things Chris Yogerst on his Substack page. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha.
Liberty Valance, he shot Liberty Valance. He was the bravest of them all.